There was never a moment in your childhood when love and control were separate things. They were fused from the very beginning so seamlessly that you probably didn't even notice the substitution happening. You thought you were being loved when you were being managed. You thought you were being cared for when you were being watched. You thought approval was affection, when really approval was the leash. And the moment you stepped even slightly outside the lines drawn for you, that love disappeared so fast, it left whiplash you're probably still carrying today. If you've ever wondered why relationships feel like walking on eggshells, why rest feels like guilt, why your own needs feel like an inconvenience you have to apologize for, today we're going all the way back to where that started. Because it didn't start with you, it started in the family that raised you. Here's what almost nobody explains clearly about growing up in a narcissistic family system, and I want you to really sit with this, because it reframes everything. Control in these families doesn't announce itself as control. It disguises itself brilliantly as love, as discipline, as concern, as tradition, as we're only doing this because we care about you. And that disguise is precisely what makes it so difficult to identify and so much harder to heal from, because you're not just untangling bad behavior. You're untangling an entire belief system that told you from your very first memories that being controlled and being loved were the same experience. So when we talk today about the difference between the home you grew up in and the home you actually needed, we're not just talking about isolated incidents. We're talking about an entire architecture built brick by brick, moment by moment, that shaped how you understand love itself and probably still shapes it right now in ways you haven't fully connected back to their source. So let's start at the foundation, because every narcissistic family system is built on the same core substitution, and once you see it, you'll recognize it everywhere. In a healthy family, love is unconditional, and behavior has consequences, but the two remain separate. You can be disciplined for something you did wrong, while still being fundamentally, unshakably loved as a person. In a narcissistic family, that separation doesn't exist. Love becomes conditional on compliance. Affection becomes a reward for meeting expectations, and withdrawal of affection becomes the primary tool of discipline. This means that from your earliest years, you learned something most people never consciously question, that love is not a stable, guaranteed thing you're entitled to simply by existing. It's a reward you have to keep earning, over and over, through good behavior, through achievement, through never becoming an inconvenience. And this is where the first major pattern shows up, something I'd call performance-based worth. If you grew up in a family like this, you probably learned very early that your value wasn't inherent. It was transactional. Good grades earned warmth. Obedience earned peace. Being quiet, easy, low maintenance earned you the privilege of not being a target. And if you ever failed to perform, if you got the bad grade, if you expressed the wrong emotion at the wrong time, if you needed something inconvenient, the warmth didn't just decrease slightly. It often vanished entirely, replaced by coldness, punishment, or a kind of emotional exile that taught your nervous system, at a bone-deep level, that your worth was never actually safe. It was always one mistake away from disappearing. And here's the part that explains so much about adult life for people who grew up this way. That belief doesn't stay in childhood. It follows you into every relationship, every job, every friendship, where you find yourself endlessly performing, endlessly achieving, endlessly trying to be low maintenance enough to avoid losing love you were never actually taught was unconditional in the first place. The second pattern that runs through almost every narcissistic family system is what I'd call the assignment of roles. Because in these families, children rarely get to exist as fully individual people with their own personalities, needs, and identities. Instead, they get cast, often unconsciously by the parents themselves, into specific roles that serve the family's psychological needs rather than the child's actual development. Maybe you were the golden child, the one whose achievements got paraded around as proof of the family's greatness. whose worth was tied entirely to how well you reflected positively on the people who raised you. Or maybe you were the scapegoat, the one who absorbed blame for the family's dysfunction, whose flaws got exaggerated and whose successes got minimized, because the family needed somewhere to direct its own unprocessed shame. Maybe you were the invisible child, the one who learned early that needs weren't going to be met no matter what. So you simply stopped having any, becoming so self-sufficient, so undemanding, that you practically disappeared inside your own household. Whichever role you were assigned, and many people shift between roles depending on circumstances, the common thread is the same. None of these roles were about who you actually were. They were about what the family system needed you to be in order to keep functioning the way it was designed to function. The third pattern, and this one is subtle enough that a lot of people don't identify it until much later in life, is emotional inversion, where children become responsible for managing their parents' emotions rather than the other way around. In a healthy family, parents regulate their own emotional states and provide a stable, calm presence for their children to lean on when things get hard. In a narcissistic family, this gets flipped entirely. You learn to read your parents' mood the second you walked in the door. You learn to adjust your own behavior, your own voice, even your own body language, based on whether they seemed irritated, whether they seemed like they were building toward an outburst, whether today was going to be a good day or a day you needed to disappear into your room and stay quiet. This isn't just stressful for a child. It's developmentally backwards, and it teaches something that becomes incredibly difficult to unlearn as an adult, that your job in relationships is to manage other people's feelings, to stay hypervigilant, to keep the peace at the cost of your own emotional needs, because that's exactly the role you were trained to play from the moment you were old enough to notice a shift in tone. The fourth pattern worth naming clearly is boundary erosion, something that happens so gradually, so consistently, that most people who grew up this way don't even realize boundaries are something they're allowed to have until well into adulthood, if they ever fully realize it at all. In narcissistic family systems, privacy gets treated as suspicious rather than normal. Personal opinions that differ from the family's get treated as betrayal rather than healthy individuality. Physical space, emotional space, even the basic right to simply not want to talk about something, all of it gets slowly eroded, replaced by an expectation of total access, total transparency, total compliance with the family's version of how things should be. And this erosion doesn't happen through one dramatic violation. It happens through 1,000 small ones. A diary read without permission and dismissed as no big deal. A no that gets pushed past until it becomes a fine, a closed door that somehow never stays closed, until eventually the child stops even trying to maintain boundaries at all, because experience has taught them over and over that boundaries in this family simply don't hold. And underneath all four of these patterns, tying them together into a single, coherent system, there's something even deeper running the whole operation, something that explains not just what happened to you, but why it happened the way it did, and why it's been so difficult to fully name, even after you've started to see the individual pieces clearly. That deeper mechanism is where we're headed next, because understanding it is what finally makes sense of everything you just walked through. That's exactly where we're going next. That deeper mechanism, the one running underneath performance-based worth, assigned roles, emotional inversion, and boundary erosion, is what I'd call the ownership model of parenting. And once you understand this, everything else we've walked through today snaps into a much clearer picture, because this isn't just one more pattern to add to the list. It's the root system every other pattern grows out of. In a healthy family, parents operate from a model of stewardship. You are raising a separate human being, someone whose thoughts, feelings, preferences, and future belong to them, not to you. And your job is to guide, protect, and gradually release them into their own autonomous life. In a narcissistic family system, that model gets replaced with something fundamentally different, an ownership model, where children are experienced, often unconsciously, as extensions of the parent, rather than separate individuals in their own right. Your achievements weren't fully your own. They were the family's achievements, reflecting back onto the people who raised you. Your emotions weren't fully your own to have. They were inconveniences to be managed or performances to be corrected. Your future wasn't fully your own to build. It was something to be directed, often toward whatever made the family look good, feel secure, or avoid the discomfort of watching you become someone they hadn't fully scripted. This ownership model explains why performance-based worth existed in the first place. If you are an extension of your parents rather than a separate person, then your success or failure isn't just about you, it's a direct reflection on them, which is exactly why achievements got rewarded so intensely and failures got punished so disproportionately. It wasn't really about your grades or your behavior, it was about what your grades and behavior said about them. This ownership model explains the assigned roles too, because a family operating from ownership rather than stewardship needs its members to play specific functions that serve the system. The golden child who provides validation, the scapegoat who absorbs blame, the invisible child who requires nothing and therefore causes no disruption. None of those roles exist to serve the child's development. All of them exist to serve the stability of a system built around control rather than genuine connection. It explains emotional inversion too, because if children exist to serve the emotional needs of the family rather than the other way around, then of course you learn to manage their moods instead of having your own moods held and supported. And it explains boundary erosion perhaps most clearly of all because ownership, by definition, does not recognize the legitimacy of boundaries. You cannot set a boundary with something you own. A boundary implies separateness, autonomy, a self that exists independently and gets to decide what it will and won't allow. In an ownership model, that kind of independence isn't just inconvenient, it's threatening to the entire structure, which is exactly why every attempt you made as a child to assert any kind of separate identity, separate opinion, separate need, so often got met with resistance, guilt, or punishment. Now here's where I want to slow down, because this is the part that tends to hit hardest once people fully absorb it. If you grew up inside this ownership model, you likely didn't just learn that your parents controlled you. You learned something far more insidious and far harder to unlearn, that control and love were fundamentally inseparable, that being cared for and being managed were the same sensation, wired together so early and so thoroughly that your nervous system genuinely cannot always tell the difference between the two, even now, even in relationships that have nothing to do with your family of origin. This is why so many people who grew up in narcissistic family systems find themselves, as adults, drawn to relationships that recreate this exact same dynamic, not because they consciously want to be controlled, but because control has become so deeply entangled with their internal definition of love that a relationship without it can actually feel, disturbingly, like something is missing. A partner who doesn't monitor you, doesn't guilt you, doesn't require constant performance to maintain their affection, can sometimes register on some deep unconscious level as indifferent rather than as healthy. This is one of the cruelest legacies of growing up this way, that the very relationships capable of actually healing you can initially feel unfamiliar enough to seem unsafe, while the relationships that recreate your original wound can feel disorientingly like coming home. This is also why boundaries feel so unnaturally difficult for so many adult children of narcissistic families, even long after they've left the household that taught them this pattern. Because setting a boundary requires believing on a bone-deep level that you are a separate person entitled to your own space, your own preferences, your own limits, and if your entire childhood taught you that separateness itself was the threat, that autonomy itself was what triggered punishment or emotional withdrawal, then boundaries don't just feel uncomfortable. They feel dangerous, like you're inviting exactly the kind of abandonment or conflict your nervous system learned, very early, to avoid at absolutely any cost. So what does healing actually require? Once you understand that the wound isn't just about specific memories or specific incidents, but about an entire framework that taught you love and control were the same thing. It requires something slower and more foundational than simply recognizing bad behavior when you see it, though that recognition is an important first step. It requires the much harder, much longer work of rebuilding your internal definition of love from the ground up, learning, often through direct, repeated experience rather than just intellectual understanding, what it actually feels like to be cared for without conditions, to be loved without having to perform for it, to have a boundary respected instead of punished, to have your emotions met with support instead of treated as an inconvenience to be managed. This rewiring doesn't happen quickly, and it rarely happens in isolation, because so much of what needs to be relearned can only really be relearned in the context of relationships. Ideally, relationships, whether therapeutic, platonic, or romantic, that are patient enough and safe enough to let you practice trusting something that used to feel like a trap. And I want to leave you with something important here, something that a lot of people who've done this work eventually come to understand. Because it's easy, when you're in the middle of untangling all of this, to feel like the child inside you was simply unlucky, like you were dealt a bad hand and now you're just stuck managing the fallout for the rest of your life. But there's another way to hold this. The fact that you can even recognize this pattern now, the fact that something in you knows, on some level, that what you experienced wasn't actually love in its healthiest form, means the part of you capable of recognizing real love was never fully extinguished. It was buried, obscured, confused by years of conditioning, but it was never destroyed. And that part of you, the one doing the recognizing right now, listening to this, nodding along at pieces that finally make sense, that part is exactly where the healing begins. Not because the past gets erased, but because you finally get to stop mistaking the old wound for the whole truth of what love is supposed to feel like. If this gave language to something you've carried quietly for a long time, know that you are far from the only one untangling this exact thing, and there's a lot more we can work through together as we go. Make sure you're subscribed, because we go deeper into this every single week.